The U.S. State Department is urging Americans to leave Russia immediately, warning of potential harassment by Russian security officials. President Vladimir Putin denied reports that he will impose martial law in Russia. Let's get an update on these developments from our U.S. correspondent, Simon Marks. It's good to speak to you, Simon. So we do know that the U.S. State Department is urging Americans to leave Russia immediately, warning of potential harassment by Russian security officials and of possible issues with accessing money within the country. What can you tell us?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there has been a travel advisory for Americans in Russia from the United States State Department for several weeks, but this is a much tougher message that American citizens in Russia are now being given, that it is time for them to leave. And that's partly because of a security crackdown that is underway in Russia, particularly against journalists who are based in Moscow, but also against Russian citizens themselves. On the streets of Moscow today, imagery of security teams stopping Russians at random, demanding to see their cell phones and looking at their WhatsApp and other social media messages to see if they have been spreading what a new Kremlin law brands as misinformation about the war in Ukraine. And by misinformation, what the Kremlin means is any reference to a war that the Russians are waging in Ukraine, or any information that is not actually disseminated by the Kremlin itself. And it's very apparent that the messaging that the Kremlin is offering about what is really taking place on the ground in Ukraine is at odds with what is really taking place on the grounds in Ukraine. The other reason why Americans are going to find it harder to be in Russia is because, as we reported 24 hours ago, Visa and MasterCard have now started terminating their services across Russia's time zones. That's going to impact foreign citizens using their credit and debit cards in Russia, but it's also, of course, going to really impact Russians themselves, who, in very large measure, have over the last few years themselves started using those credit and debit cards to settle bills and make payments. So a security crackdown, but also financial sanctions coming together, resulting in this advisory to Americans in Russia.
Certainly a very worrying picture. We also know that President Vladimir Putin denied reports that he will impose martial law in Russia. What are you hearing?
Well, those reports have been circulating for several days, and they have created a real sense of panic among Russians, certainly many Russians that I've spoken to over the last few days, who are worried that martial law or emergency powers, whatever you call it, would see conscription reintroduced in Russia and people being forced to sign up for the military to go and fight this war in Ukraine that is now into its 10th day and is evidently not going as well or as rapidly as Russian commanders had expected, and Russia's defense minister is believed to have told the Russian President Vladimir Putin that he could expect. So this move by President Putin is an effort, I think, to soothe some of the panic that has led to remarkable scenes of cars trying to leave Russia and head to Finland on the ferry from St. Petersburg. Any Russian that already has a Schengen visa and enough money to pay for the passage can make that journey to Finland. So we're beginning to see an exodus of people from Russia itself, but nothing like the exodus that's taking place from Ukraine. Within the last few minutes, the Polish government has confirmed that nearly 1 million Ukrainians have crossed Ukraine's border with Poland alone since Russia's invasion began. And of course there are other borders with other countries, particularly Moldova and Romania, that are seeing a substantial increase in traffic from Ukraine as well. So, you know, one of the consequences of this war is going to be, according to the United Nations, a monumental migration of human beings from Ukraine and from Russia. The UN already warning this is going to be the most serious migrant crisis of this century.
Certainly, Simon, especially if you're saying that since the invasion of Russia into Ukraine, you're seeing 1 million people from Ukraine moving into Poland. So you can imagine what's happening with other neighboring countries as well. I want us to move over to another very concerning issue that I think even here in South Africa we are quite worried about. We do understand that there are growing indications that the Biden administration will soon ban or deeply restrict Russian oil imports to the US. So this could possibly mean petrol prices in the United States increasing rapidly.
Yeah, I mean, they are already increasing rapidly, and that's before this ban, if it's going to be unveiled, is announced. I mean, I was looking at the numbers just overnight. Petrol prices in California, which is just one example, but it happens to be the hardest hit state, rose by 25 cents a gallon here in a matter of hours, and people in California now paying close to $6 a gallon for petrol, which if you'd suggested a couple of weeks ago that that might be the case, everybody would have said psychologically it's impossible for American motorists to be confronted with those kinds of prices. But there's no question that public opinion here is moving in favour of banning imports of oil from Russia. The Biden administration, very concerned about the impact of all of this for American motorists, carved out of the sanctions that they've already imposed on Russia the ability for the Americans to pay Russia for Russian oil. But as Americans and people around the world have consumed those harrowing images from the battlefields of Ukraine, so public support has been building for a ban. And there are some prominent Democrats in Congress now urging the Biden administration to do that. The Secretary of State indicated today that a ban on those Russian oil imports to the United States may be announced this week. But if other countries also follow suit in that regard and Russian oil becomes the oil that nobody wants to touch, that is going to lead to a supply crunch, and a supply crunch is going to lead to higher prices, not just at American pumps, but at petrol pumps all over the world.
Certainly, I think that's something that we are watching very closely even here in South Africa. I want us to move over to the fact that there are reports that the US favors getting more weaponry and aircraft into the hands of the Ukrainians in the next few days. Surely this is going to spark the risk of spiraling conflict in Ukraine.
Yeah, and I think that that risk of spiralling conflict, frankly, exists whatever the United States does in this regard. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, appearing on the Sunday television talk programs here today, announced that the United States is considering the possibility of allowing Poland, a NATO member, to provide fighter jets to Ukraine that Ukrainian pilots would fly. It wouldn't be Polish pilots flying those fighters. And the United States will then replace the fighters that Poland supplies to Ukraine with fresh fighter jets that would be shipped to Poland from the United States. Now, the Russians are already arguing that that would be tantamount to a NATO country, Poland, and possibly even the United States, engaged in active conflict with Russia. In other words, the message from the Kremlin and from senior defense officials in Moscow over the last few hours has been that that is too clever an approach by the United States and Poland by half. But the Biden administration and other governments within NATO are under tremendous pressure now to do more to assist Ukrainians. I mean, again, we saw within the last few hours efforts at the creation of a humanitarian corridor and a ceasefire collapse within moments of them due to be taking hold as the Russians continued shelling civilians. Harrowing stories coming from various parts of the country, women, children and families being killed in those Russian attacks after a ceasefire was due to take hold. So there's pressure mounting on President Biden and on other leaders within NATO to do more to help Ukraine. President Zelensky appeared on video link on Saturday before members of the United States Senate, pleaded with them to provide more weaponry through this route, Polish fighter jets to Ukraine, and actually warned them, as he spoke to them, that this might be the last time they ever see him, that his own personal safety and security is at such substantial risk. And that, again, has raised the heat beneath the Biden administration to find a way of doing more, short of committing US forces to a conflict with Russia that absolutely could very rapidly spiral out of control.
And Simon, as you were answering this question, I mean, we were showing harrowing pictures of what's going on in Ukraine, and it's just unbelievable to see what's going on, and our families have been displaced, people trying to flee and leave. It's truly heartbreaking to watch. I want us to speak about the US ambassador to Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. We do understand that experts are saying that investigations will commence soon against with regards to Russian war crimes. We know that that's apparently supposed to start in a matter of days, but it's going to be very difficult, and you'll explain why, to actually deploy people to Ukraine immediately, given what's actually going on there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this move to begin war crimes investigations really goes to those images, those harrowing images that we are seeing from the battlefields of Ukraine, that in many ways are so redolent of the imagery from World War II between 1939 and 1945, except we're seeing them in real time via social media. We're not seeing them long after the event. And so the US ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation, Michael Carpenter, who had already earlier in the week said every single step of this Russian invasion needs to be documented in case there is a reference for war crimes charges later on, is now saying that investigations actively are preparing to get underway. The difficulty, of course, is that you can't really send investigators into the heart of the conflict zone, because it seems very unlikely, and absolutely impossible, that the Russians would guarantee them any kind of safe passage. And, of course, there'd be huge risks to them, even if they were able to get to the battlefields, of being themselves caught up in this conflict. But there is so much social media evidence now in the public domain. Everyone in Ukraine filming everything on their cell phones and immediately disseminating those images through social media, that outside Ukraine there's a lot that investigators can start to gather and piece together as they build a possible case to bring war crimes charges against Russian military commanders, quite possibly Russian President Vladimir Putin, his Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, his Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu. Certainly this is a pressure point, at least, that the United States wants to keep in place against the Kremlin elites in a fresh bid to try and create pressure within the Kremlin for someone to go to Vladimir Putin and say, Mr. President, we're going to lose everything here, including our liberty. This has got to stop.
I'm wondering if anybody has actually said that to him and if he's willing to listen, but I do think the pressure is definitely mounting, and as you said, the heat is on, and hopefully there's just some kind of resolution here. Just lastly, Simon, let's speak about the thousands arrested at a protest in Russia. I've seen many posts on social media, on Twitter, where people are saying in Russia that are saying they do not agree with what is going on in Ukraine. Tell us about this protest and how thousands were arrested.
Yeah, substantial protests all over the country. In Moscow, in St. Petersburg, in Novosibirsk, out in Siberia, there were reports of hundreds of people being arrested. It takes a lot of courage in Russia today to take to the streets and protest, especially given the presence not only of security forces, who you can see on video shared on social media, are brutalizing some of those protesters as they arrest them and take them away, but also who are now grabbing people's cell phones and going through them, seeking evidence that they, the protesters, have broken this new law on misinformation that Vladimir Putin signed on Thursday, which is very much designed to make sure that the only information the average Russian citizen hears is the message that Vladimir Putin wants them to hear. which is not a message that chimes with the reality of what is taking place inside Ukraine. So the fact that so many people took to the streets of Russia today is testament to their courage and bravery, but I think the White House and governments within NATO and America's European allies and partners will look at this as fresh evidence that there are some Russians willing to convey the message to Vladimir Putin that he is completely on the wrong track, even if it results in them being incarcerated and possibly even worse.
Great. Thank you so much for your insights and that very important update. That was eNCA's US correspondent Simon Marks coming to us live from Washington.